Hey all, let's look at the relation between price and real GDP supplied, which is also called the aggregate supply curve. So here we will look at everything from the seller's perspective, unlike the aggregate demand curve. So when we looked at the aggregate demand curve, we looked at the relation between price and real gross domestic product demanded. And the aggregate demand curve was what we looked at. This is downward sloping. So always with these graphs, the price or the output price will be on the vertical axis and the real gross domestic product will be on the horizontal axis. Now the aggregate supply curve, the shape depends on the time horizon. So intermediate short run, the input prices and output prices are fixed. In the short run, input prices are fixed but output prices are variable. In the long run, both input and output prices are variable. Example of output is a car. Example of inputs are whatever we need in the production of the car, which can be labor, raw materials, etc. Now take a look at the shape of the aggregate supply curve in the intermediate short run. Okay, we have a horizontal line. This means the output price is fixed. So definitely on the vertical axis, as I said before, we always look at the output price. And the horizontal axis, we have the real gross domestic product. And QF is the full employment gross domestic product. That means the gross domestic product when economy uses 100% of its resources like land, labor, capital, and natural resources. So, as output prices are fixed, the farms can supply whatever it wants to the farms can supply whatever quantity demanded at this fixed price. So the input prices are also fixed, as for example, wages are fixed because of contractual labor agreements. So as you can see here, if quantity demanded is small, the farms are gonna sell a smaller amount. If the quantity demanded goes up from 50 to 100, the farms are going to supply a higher amount. And definitely this output price is not going to change, it's fixed. Next we look at the short run. So always remember the farm's objective is profit maximization. Input prices are also fixed like the intermediate short run. However, output prices which we have on the vertical axis can change. So as you can see here, we have an upward sloping aggregate supply curve because when output prices are increasing, farms will sell more output. Okay, so the price goes up from $100 to $200 just for example, and the quantity supplied increases from 100 to 200 units. Okay, now let's look at the long run aggregate supply curve. This is a vertical straight line and both input and output prices are variable. So this long run aggregate supply curve is vertical because as both input and output prices can change, the profits will adjust and farms will always produce the full employment output level. So if the demand increases, say this is 81, this is 82, this will just increase the price level, but the output will be fixed. So in this long run, what we see here is output is fixed at the full employment level of gross domestic product. So this is different from the intermediate short run where we had the output price, this was fixed and quantity was allowed to change. And the short run, both prices and output, prices can increase, output can increase, or both can go down. Okay. Alrighty, so now we know about the shapes of the aggregate supply curve at different time horizons. So next thing we are going to look at is changes in the aggregate supply curve. So the aggregate supply curve can go to the right and also it can go to the left. So let's say A is 1. This is the initial aggregate supply curve. If the aggregate supply curve it shifts to the right, this means the sellers are selling more goods. Now if the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, this means the sellers are selling less. Okay, what are the reasons that the aggregate supply curve will shift to the right or shift to the left? So one of the most important reason is input prices. We can look at domestic inputs or price of imported resources and also the exchange rates. So if any of these input prices increases, aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. However, if the price of these domestic resources, if this and imported resources, if those goes down, the aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. Now we look at exchange rates. If dollar appreciates in value compared to a foreign currency, the domestic producers will import more. This will lower the per unit production cost and this will make the aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. Okay. Now let's look at the definition of productivity and the definition of per unit production cost. So productivity is equal to total output over total inputs. So if productivity increases, the aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. If per unit production cost, if this increases, aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. Now what happens with taxes and subsidy? So if taxes increases, as for example, if business taxes, payroll taxes, if any of those goes up, the aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. So if taxes are going up, no matter what taxes we look at, it can be excise taxes, payroll taxes, business taxes, capital gains taxes. So everything increases the per unit production cost and the aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. Subsidies are tax breaks that government provides to producers. So subsidies will lower the per unit production cost, unlike taxes. And this will cause the aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. Okay. Now we look at the extent of government regulations. Say we have less complex regulations and probably there are deregulations in certain sectors. Those will reduce per unit production costs and will make the aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. Okay, that's all we need to know about aggregate supply curve. So we looked at the shape of the aggregate supply curve for different time periods, and then we looked at what shifts the aggregate supply curve to the right or to the left. Thank you very much.